So now what we're going to look at is the Inter-Testamental Period. So you've got the Old Testament, that's the first part of the Bible, and then you've got the New Testament, which is the second part of the Bible. And the thing is, there's actually a gap between the Old and the New Testament of about 400 years where nothing is written in the Bible. Okay, so what we're doing right now is just history to see what happened in this time period. So if you remember from last week, there was the exile, right? And under Cyrus, a number of Jews came back to Jerusalem and they rebuilt the temple and the walls of Jerusalem. And so in a sense they'd returned from exile. But we see that it wasn't a proper, full fulfillment of what the prophets had prophesied would happen with the exiles being gathered and being given a new heart and being put in the land. And there would be many Israelites who still felt like they were in exile because, one, there was a lot of Israelites who lived outside of Palestine. Okay, so there were what's called the diaspora. Yeah, the Jews who are spread all over the world, and the phrase Jew actually comes from the period of the exile. They weren't called Jews before then. And also, even the guys who living in Israel or living in Palestine, right? They were ruled by the Persians. You had the Persian Empire. So it wasn't like, yeah, we're in Israel. Instead, it's like, these guys are in Palestine. And it's ruled by the Persians. You got the Persian Empire. Then after the Persian Empire, you get the Greek Empire turn up. So still, the Israelites are like, we're not free. We haven't got our own freedom. And with the Greek Empire, you had Alexander the Great, who you've probably heard about, who went around the world basically making everyone Greek and adopting Greek culture and Greek language. And then after Alexander died, his empire divided into two groups, the Ptolemies, yeah, and the Seleucids. Now the Ptolemies were down in Egypt and the Seleucids were up in Syria. And these guys now are warring for who's going to control the world, and it's particularly Israel. So the Ptolemies down in Egypt, they take charge of Israel. So all the Israelites are now like, oh, they're our boss. We're still not free. But then the Seleucids took over and now they're in charge of Israel. So it's still like, we've got our little temple now, but we're still not properly out of exile because we're ruled by another group. And then after these guys, the next empire comes in, the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire comes and runs Israel. And again, the people, they still haven't properly been freed from exile. Now what they thought was that what they got to do now, the Israelites have got to be faithful to the law in the Old Testament, yeah, the Torah. They've got to be faithful to the Torah, and if they are, then God will stop punishing them and they bring an end to all of this exile, and we see the prophecies fulfilled that have been prophesied. And what they do is, we're not too sure exactly when it started, but it appears to be sometime during the exile, they started up synagogues. Okay, so all over the place, yeah, there's these synagogues set up where you can go and pray and worship and be taught the Torah. And from this comes the oral tradition where people start teaching people that this is how you apply the Torah, the law, in everyday life. Now the synagogues didn't replace the temple. In people's minds, right, the synagogue didn't replace the temple. They still paid temple tax. And Jews from all over the world would come and visit Jerusalem and make pilgrimages there when there were special festivals. Now what also is going on, once the Greeks take over with Alexander the Great, is you get a thing called Hellenization. Right? Hellenization, because the word for Greece is, what is it, Hellenas? Because they had a chief way back called Hellen. And so when you see the word Hellen, it's talking about Greece, right? So Hellenization is where everyone's adopting Greek culture. And I've called it Greekification, because I just think that's easier to understand. Okay, it's a made-up word, Greekification. A lot of this whole biblical theology course, I've got a lot of my resources been influenced a lot by a book called The Drama of Scripture, what I've shown you before. They don't use the word Greekification, that's my own little word there. Now, with Greekification, right, there's a pressure and a temptation for the Israelites to follow pagan culture. Yeah, when Alexander turns up and takes over a people, he says to them, you can be Greek now. You know, he doesn't rape and pillage them and decimate them and ransack the temple. Instead he says, you can be Greek now. You can adopt my language and you can be educated and you'll become Greek. So that's a big temptation to move to this culture. But after Alexander the Great, when you get these Seleucids and the Ptolemies, when the Seleucids take over Israel, they have a really bad dude who leads them called Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus is a bad dude. One time, yeah, he enters the temple at Jerusalem, right? And he ransacks it, he steals all that cool stuff in it that you read about in Exodus, right? And in Kings or whatever. So he plunders the temple. Not only that, but what he also does one time is he sets up an altar to Zeus inside the temple. And he actually sacrifices a pig in it, which to Jews it would be disgusting anyway, but the fact it's a pig makes it even more disgusting. And then what he also did was he outlawed circumcision, and he outlawed observing the Sabbath, and he outlawed temple sacrifices, and he burned copies of the Torah. So Antiochus is really trying to stop any kind of Jewish practice here. He wants these people to just follow him. Now, as a result of this, you get what's called the Maccabean Revolt, right? The Maccabees, these guys called the Maccabees, and the Maccabees means the hammers. Yeah, it's not West Ham, right? But they're called the hammers because they're revolutionaries. And the Maccabees, they fight back against the Seleucids. And 3 years after Antiochus goes into the temple and desecrates it, 3 years later, the Maccabees, they ride into Jerusalem. And they ride in to people shouting, Hosanna! And people waving palm branches. And what they do then is they cleanse the temple. See, so this is interesting. You look at this, and then if you know what's coming later in the New Testament, you're like, oh, that's interesting. They cleanse the temple, and then you get some blokes who rule Israel a bit later, because it takes about 20 years to actually get rid of the... who's that, Antiochus from?
Seleucids.
Seleucids, thank you. It takes about 20 years to do that, and the Hasmoneans take over, who are kind of like related to the Maccabees. And the Hasmoneans rule Israel, but the problem with the Hasmoneans is they like paganism. They're affected by paganism, and they like Greek culture, so they're affected by that. And we find out that they like power. So they want to keep their power, which means they act a certain way, which isn't good. Then the Roman Empire comes on the scene. Well, it's been around for a while, but for our purposes of this story, the Roman Empire now is the next empire. And they are an oppressive regime. They take a different approach to Alexander the Great. And they're very oppressive to the Israelites. Okay? They don't let the Israelites govern themselves. Instead, the Romans use their puppet leaders, which would be like Herod, who is from the Hasmoneans, which is why there's a lot of Jews in Jesus' day who don't like Herod. And they also bring in their own leaders, guys like Pontius Pilate, to be governors. And they don't let the Jews do the death penalty, so they can't do their own governing. And they also appoint who the priests are going to be in the temple. So you've got these Romans appointing priests. So what happens is you get these revolutionary movements in Israel fighting against the Romans. Now the Romans hated rebellion, and they would be really harsh on any rebellions. So you'd get these Jewish groups who would rebel against the Romans and kill a whole bunch of Roman soldiers or kill compromising Jewish leaders who've sold out to the Romans. And they would be led by messianic figures, guys who kind of rose up like, I'm the Messiah. And so the Romans would be brutal in dealing with these guys. And these uprisings were happening because Israel was desperate for change. They didn't like being under the Romans, and they hoped that one day a Messiah was going to come, that God was going to come, intervene and set up his kingdom. But the interesting thing is, different Jews saw the Messiah in different ways. Some people thought the Messiah was going to come like a priest, and he was going to clean up the temple and he'd be the priest. Other people thought he was going to come as a king. Now other people thought there'd be multiple Messiahs, there'd be a whole bunch of different Messiahs coming. But in general, you didn't